Hi, I'm Jaden Rivelis, and today I'm going to read a newspaper. I think it's about Peter Buxton, but I don't really know much about that. So let's get into it.
Looks like it's about Peter Buxton. So it says, Peter Buxton, whistleblower, does a lot of things to end the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. He reports the unethical behavior depicted by the professionals running the experiment, and he sheds light on a terrible experiment that occurred. Sounds interesting. I think that guy in the picture is him. The story's continued on slide 2, and I'm pretty interested, so I think I'm gonna see what there is to read about it. Let's see. We have a job description from 1965. All right, let's see. So the company that this job is for is the United States Public Health Service, the USPHS, and the position is venereal disease investigator. So here's the job description. So we have to interview patients with sexually transmitted diseases. We have to discover the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. We have to realize how unethical the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is, and we have to report the experiment to the Washington Star. Sounds like things that Peter Buxton did. Let's see what's next. So what actually was the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? So it's an experiment that was conducted from 1932 to 1972 by the U.S. Public Health Service at Tuskegee University. This was in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is an area that had the highest rate of syphilis. So the study involved 600 poverty-stricken African-American men. 399 of them had syphilis, and 201 did not, and they were the control group. So everyone was told that they would be receiving free medical care for a 6-month duration, but it was actually extended to 40 years, which is, not that close to 6 months. And so the experiment was done to perform autopsies to see what syphilis does to the body. Essentially, these people, they wanted them to die so that they could test their bodies. The men were not told that they had syphilis, just that they had... Oh, sorry, I think my voice cracked. Because they didn't know they had syphilis, they didn't know the effects of the disease. These effects include, but are not limited to, deafness, blindness, death, mental illness issues, problems with the central nervous system, and the fact that it could be spread to others. In terms of treatment, I only hear crickets. There really weren't any treatments. The patients were given placebo pills, aspirin, and then some other ineffective methods. Now, the experiment ended in 1972, but by around 1947, penicillin was the typical treatment for syphilis. This was not given to the patients. Funding was lost for treatment, but the men were not informed. So when they were promised medical treatment, this was during the Depression. So funding was lost, but, obviously they had to keep going with the experiment. Really got to make it completely unethical here. Now enter Peter Buxton. So let's go back a little bit and learn some about his background. So he came to America as an infant when his family fled the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. And he also earned a European history degree at the University of Oregon. So he knows a lot about what went on in Europe. He was obviously horrified by the experiment. He realized that this experiment shared some parallels with the Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1947, which was a Nazi experiment. And so he wrote a report on the similarities, but doctors insisted that the men were volunteers and that everything was fine, and that this was all for science, and it was as it was supposed to be. But when the report eventually reached higher-ups in the USPHS, Buxton faced a lot of backlash. So here's a direct quote from him regarding what a doctor said about his report. He was infuriated and thought of me as some form of lunatic who needed chastisement, and proceeded to administer it. But nothing came from this, and nothing happened with the experiment. Thankfully, Buxton did not stop there. So in 1968, he re-challenged the USPHS, and let's think about what happened in 1968. So this is the year that the Civil Rights Act was written into law, and Buxton shared that every patient was African American, which was a huge problem by itself. He called it political dynamite. He also shared that the patients were unaware that they were involved in a study. Buxton argued that if the experiment was not aborted, the victims would have to be financially compensated, and no one wanted to do that. So a blue ribbon panel of doctors voted, and they decided to continue the experiment. Fantastic. But nothing came from this. But he did not stop there. So in 1972, Buxton met with Jean Heller, and she was a reporter for the Washington Star to expose the USPHS for the experiment. The article was published on July 25th, 1972. By July 26th, the day after, it was on the front page in the New York Times. This is when we start to see a shift in the experiment, and this is what leads to its end. Obviously, this created a national uproar. So Senator Edward Kennedy got involved, and he held congressional hearings at which Buxton testified. Here's a direct quote from Buxton. "I feel what was being done was very close to an institutional form of murder. It had become an accepted thing within the public health service, not subject to review." The United States Public Health Service still claimed they did nothing wrong. They said that this was done in the glory of science, and they said that people were just doing their jobs, government workers, and people involved in this civil case. Thankfully, the experiment was terminated, and at this point, patients knew what was going on. All survivors of the experiment, plus 50 wives who had contracted syphilis and 20 children who also had syphilis, were all treated with penicillin. A lot of people did die from this experiment, though. And you have to remember that was the goal because they wanted to see the effects of syphilis on a dead body through autopsies. A while later, the survivors sued, and it was supposed to be a couple $1 billion, but they settled for $10 million. Thankfully, a lot of changes came about after the termination of the experiment. So in 1974, the National Research Act was written into law, and this created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And this essentially described how research with participants should be held. And informed consent was required for all studies involving participants. That means that if someone is participating in an experiment, they need to know what is happening and the purpose, and they just need to know everything about the experiment so that it's all ethical. In 1997, President Clinton publicly apologized for what had happened, and he explained that the United States government did a terrible, terrible thing. From 1980 to 1983, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research really came about, and it monitored how bioethical rules were followed. Bioethics were closely monitored and revolutionized until 2009. So in the late 1970s, the Ethics Advisory Board was formed, and then in 1995, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission was formed. In 2001, the President's Council on Bioethics was formed, and then in 2009, the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues was formed. All of these just focused on bioethics in studies and just making sure that participants knew what was going on and that nothing similar to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment would ever happen again. And here is Peter Buxton today. He is viewed as a hero for causing the termination of the experiment and really bringing about all of the laws about bioethics that we just talked about. And he's applauded for attempting to fight against the United States Public Health Service so many times. He wrote 2 reports, and then he continued fighting. He met with Jean Heller. He did a lot, and he is currently 83 years old, and he still does some public speaking about what happened. Let's continue reading our newspaper. This is the comic strip, but I think we'll get to this another time. Here are my references, and thanks for reading with me.